Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 5 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Boston Bruins, in which the Sharks have lost 4-3. So officially, the Sharks' winning streak to start the season has come to an end at 4. It was definitely a very fun, a very good run for the Sharks, but all good things must come to an end. This team, or any team for that matter, is not going to go 82-0, so a loss was bound to happen, and while many people would have obviously loved for it to go on a bit longer, here is that loss today. And just generally, kind of like how I expected in the Toronto Maple Leafs game a couple of days ago, this was pretty much a game that was very, very difficult for the Sharks to win, just kind of situationally. So I talked about the game on Thursday against the Ottawa Senators and then the game on Friday against the Toronto Maple Leafs were back-to-back with less than 24 hours between them. Obviously, the NHL can't then set up a third game in a row on a Saturday, so they gave the Sharks the Saturday off, but then immediately scheduled for them for a game on Sunday, still on the road, still having to travel, and it was an afternoon game at 1 o'clock local time. So still very, very compressed schedule to start this season. The Sharks definitely looking very tired for this one, and you could tell at the start of the game that was the case. The Sharks did not look at all ready to play in this one. First shift of the game, the Bruins already taking a 1-0 lead. Brent Burns in particular looked completely lost on this regard between a passing play of the Bruins' first line and Marchand just left not necessarily alone because he had 4 Sharks players surrounding him kind of in a box formation, but nobody actually able to get their stick on this shot from the slot by Marchand, and he puts it over the into the top corner past Adin Hill to make it 1-0. And it would only be a couple minutes later where the Bruins would get their second goal of this first period, this one coming from Derek Forbort. Not necessarily the fault of the players in front of Adin Hill as much as it was the fault of the goaltender himself, but we'll get to that a bit later. At the 2-0 point lead for the Bruins, this was an unfamiliar territory for the San Jose Sharks. Previously this season, they've trailed 1 goal to the Ottawa Senators and made the comeback there, and even 2 goals to the Winnipeg Jets, and still ended up winning that game 4-3. And the Sharks definitely put on some pressure after that, thanks to 2 straight power plays that they actually got due to some Bruins penalties, and they had some great opportunities to try and tie, or at least get within 1 in this game and almost tie the game as well, but just some missed opportunities on those power plays. Barabanov an open net to shoot out, but ends up sending it wide. Dahlin on the second power play of that period, also a great opportunity, but sent it off the side of the net. And eventually it would actually be the Bruins on their own power play in that first period who would get the third goal of this game. A beautiful, unstoppable shot from David Pastrnak to make it 3-0. The Sharks would actually get back in just a few moments later as Jasper Weatherby would score his second of his career to make it 3-1, and that would be the score at the end of the first period. Again, not unfamiliar territory for the Sharks being down a couple of goals, but it was definitely going to take a minor miracle to be able to come back in this game. Come second period, it was just a few minutes in before Jake DeBrusk would score the Bruins' 4th goal and last goal of this game, and would actually end up getting Adin Hill pulled out of the net, and James Reimer would come in relief. For the rest of the second period, the Bruins would put up some shots, the Sharks a couple of shots of their own, but nothing doing in terms of goal scoring, and it would be a 4-1 game at the end of 40 minutes. In the third period is where the Sharks showed a few signs of life and really gave hope for what this means going into the rest of the season. Obviously, this wasn't a great start to this third period for the Sharks. For the first half of it, pretty much, the Sharks did not actually record a shot on goal. The Bruins themselves were actually controlling the majority of the pace in that first half of the third period, and even hit a post at a point. But eventually the Sharks managed to break through. They got a very nice play from Tomas Hertl, individual effort along the boards, got the puck to the point, and then a beautiful tip in front to make it 4-2, come within 2 goals. And then just a couple minutes later, it would be Timo Meier doing a very similar type of tip to get within 1 for the Sharks. So in a game where they were pretty heavily outplayed in general by the Boston Bruins, they still found themselves within 1 goal with 5 minutes left to go in the third period. Very impressive, to say the least. And so this was the first time this season where the San Jose Sharks were actually in a 6-on-5 situation with their own goaltender pulled at the end of the third period. They loaded up. They had Burns and Carlson, Couture and Hertl, all these great players on the ice, but unfortunately just unable to get that game-tying goal. And the Sharks will get this this first loss of the season, 4-3. When it comes to the lineup, honestly, not a ton to say. Obviously, there were 2 substitutions into the lineup, and I'll talk about those somewhat extensively, but otherwise, this was kind of one of those games, as I said earlier on, that was slightly more acceptable, I guess you could say, in terms of a loss. Obviously, a lot of players didn't necessarily have the most effective games, necessarily have the best games, but it's a lot more excusable when your team was already 4-0 and is now going 4-1 compared to if your team had been 0-4 and was now going 0-5. So first, I guess, mention the first line. This was probably the first time this season where the first line was actually outplayed by the other team's first line, which is definitely understandable considering the Bruins are, of course, still running as they have been for the past, millennium, it seems, of Bergeron, Pastrnak, and Brad Marchand. One of the best lines in the entire league, probably top 3 up there with the Avalanche first line of Rantanen, McKinnon, and Landeskog when those 3 players are together, and I guess whoever happens to be with McDavid and Draisaitl that day. So a very, very strong first line that the Bruins have, and they were very good here tonight. The Sharks' first line, honestly, not awful, still showed some signs of life, still had some decent plays, but definitely nowhere near as dominant as they had been in the first 4 games of the season. But past that point, and expectedly so while this line remained together for the entire game, the other 3 lines ended up getting dropped into the line blender. The first time we have seen the appearance of the line blender this season. We saw a lot of movement up and down the lineup as we move to the latter half of this game. But let's first talk about the first substitution of this game. That was Barabanov stepping into the lineup in favor of William Eklund onto the second line with Hurdle and Balcers. Now, how did Barabanov do? Well, I don't think he was necessarily worse than Eklund had been over the past few games. Not saying that Eklund was bad, but I don't think Barabanov was, so bad that Eklund needs to step back in immediately to play in his position. But I also don't think Barabanov was necessarily better than Eklund in any ways, I would say. Eklund had more high highs, but also more low lows, while Barabanov was a bit more of a consistent force in this game. Now, some people can point to the ice time as, a reasoning for Bob Booner maybe trusting Barabanov a bit more. Obviously, Eklund in the past couple of games had been getting about 11 and a half minutes in terms of ice time, while Barabanov here tonight got almost 16 minutes of ice time. But you also have to consider the situations of the differences between tonight's game and the previous couple of games. Against the Leafs and the Ottawa Senators, the Sharks were holding a lead. They needed more defensively minded players on the ice, which is why Eklund ended up getting benched for a good chunk of the latter part of that game. While here tonight, the Sharks were trying to make the comeback, and so you're kind of benching your defensive players and allowing your offensive players free rein to try and get those goals to get them back into the game, which is why Barabanov had more ice time. Just to kind of further support that idea, we also can take a look at Nick Benino's ice time in this game compared to the previous ones. Against the Toronto Maple Leafs, he played almost a full 20 minutes as the highest time on ice forward for the San Jose Sharks, because he is such a reliable defensive player for the Sharks when they were holding that 2 and then 1 goal lead. But here tonight, only about 15 and a half minutes because the Sharks were playing catch up compared to playing turtle this game. So Barabanov, no surprise that he ended up with more ice time than Eklund. I don't think that's necessarily indicative of what's going to be happening in the future between those two players to see which one actually comes into the lineup. If I had to make a prediction about which one is in the lineup, if we are deciding between those two players, of course, for the next game, I would guess Barabanov finishes the road trip, but I wouldn't be surprised to see Eklund potentially for the first game back after that, back at home. Moving on to the third line, I guess you could say Labanc, Benino, and Nieto. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, the line blender was in effect. At a point, one of the lines became Benino, Balcers, and Gadjevich, who of course were 3 players who started on completely different lines this game. So it's kind of hard to evaluate the third line in kind of in their own light, I guess you could say, but none of these players necessarily really blew me away. I thought Nieto actually didn't have too bad of a game. A couple of pretty decent offensive plays, but otherwise nothing particularly special. But the line that I do want to talk about is, of course, this fourth line, which had been a massive liability thus far for the San Jose Sharks this season when it was the 3 players of Peterson, Cogliano, and Jasper Weatherby. And so at the end of last game in that review, I talked about how, I thought Peterson should definitely be subbed out for this upcoming game here today against the Boston Bruins, and that's exactly what ended up happening. Gadjovich steps in and immediately makes an impact with this fourth line. I don't want to necessarily say they were the best line for the Sharks here tonight, but they definitely were up there with that first line. This was a very effective trio of players. Weatherby looked significantly better than he had done in the previous 4 games. Cogliano still quite solid, and Gadjovich just doing a lot more than what Lane Peterson was doing in this particular role. Gadjovich actually had a very nice passing play with Weatherby on the goal that he actually scored near the end of the first period. So definitely a very strong substitution, especially when you compare to the not as great substitution of Barabanov in for Eklund. This was a clear improvement, and so while I was unsure who would be playing in the next game between Barabanov and Eklund, I'm absolutely 100% sure that Gadjovich will be in the lineup over Lane Peterson for the next game against Nashville on Tuesday. Moving on to the defensive side of things, as I said, the kind of spotty defense in this game was a bit more excusable just because of the situation that the Sharks were in. One thing that I do want to mention, actually 2 things that I'll mention. First one here has to do with Mario Ferraro. If we take a look at the ice times in this game, Ferraro had 27 and a half minutes of ice time in this game, which is just an insane amount. I don't actually know this for sure, but I would not be surprised if this was his highest ice time of his career, keeping it sort of head-to-head with the ice time of Brent Burns, only 8 seconds behind him here tonight. I don't remember the last time Brent Burns was challenged this much in terms of ice time, besides in maybe games that the Sharks were just so overwhelmingly the favorite to win, up like 4-0, 5-0, where Brent Burns didn't end up. In a close game like this one ended up being, the fact that Ferraro was even within a few seconds of Brent Burns definitely says a lot about Mario Ferraro's progress this season. And so while this wasn't a perfect game for Ferraro by any means, it wasn't a perfect game by any of these Sharks defenders, it definitely shows that a lot of trust is being put into that player. And the other player I do want to talk about actually is Erik Karlsson. Obviously, I already talked about many times that this wasn't a great defensive game from anybody on the San Jose Sharks, but I do want to talk about Erik Karlsson on the offensive side of things. I thought he had some very nice plays this season offensively, or not this season, this game offensively, making some great rushes up the ice. I do think, however, there wasn't a lot of offensive support for Erik Karlsson. He made some really nice moves, managed to carry the puck into the zone single-handedly himself, but then when he kind of looked for a passing opportunity, nobody on the Sharks were able to actually find themselves open for a pass from Carlson. So it kind of ended up just dying in there and on his stick, and eventually the Bruins would just move it the other way. So hopefully team can work a bit more around what Erik Karlsson is able to do, because he was making some really nice single sort of solo effort moves in this game, just not really anything resulting from that. When it comes to the goaltending, of course, I said I would get to this eventually, and here we are. Adin Hill, his first bad game as a San Jose Shark. Obviously, this first and the third goal that he let in didn't really have much of a chance on either of those, and you could say he didn't have a ton of a chance on the DeBrusk goal, though definitely a savable shot. However, the Derek Forbort one is one of those that is kind of inexcusable. You can't really look past that one. That's a save that he has to make in a situation like that, but he just didn't come up with the big save like he had been doing in his previous few starts for the San Jose Sharks, so he was rightfully pulled in this game. But to move on from Hill, we should talk a lot about James Reimer, who comes in relief just about 5 minutes into the second period, so actually had more time on ice than Adin Hill had in this game, and Reimer looked very, very solid in relief of Adin Hill. Obviously, the Bruins not pushing as much, I guess you could say, as they were when Adin Hill was in net, because they already had secured a pretty solid lead for themselves, although it ended up being rather precarious with the way the Sharks put up 2 goals right at the end of the game. But I must say that Reimer, very, very nice performance. So when it comes to who will actually get the next game against Nashville on Tuesday, I would have thought at the start of this game, and even when Hill was pulled, that Hill would probably be back in nets for that game. But with how Reimer did in relief, it honestly wouldn't be a massive surprise if he actually found himself between the pipes for that game. But it'll definitely be an interesting choice between Hill and Reimer that Booner will have to make. That will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action, as I said, against the Nashville Predators, the final game of this 5-game road trip where they are currently 3-1, and we'll see if the Sharks can actually get their first win of the season against a non-Canadian team. Class dismissed.